Hi there, welcome to What's Happening in Brazil. Let's start with the latest news from the country.
Considered the guru of the Brazilian far-right, Olavo de Carvalho died on January 24th at the age of 74. His family posted the news on social media but did not reveal the cause of Olavo's death. At the beginning of January this year, he was diagnosed with COVID-19 and cancelled the online classes he taught. He posted many denialist messages during the pandemic. Some of these posts doubted that people were dying of COVID. Olavo de Carvalho lived in the United States and presented himself as a philosophy professor, despite not having a philosophy degree. He had a crucial role in the ideological formation of Bolsonarism. Olavo indicated 3 ministers, Ricardo Velez and Abraham Weintraub to the Ministry of Education and Ernesto Araújo to Foreign Affairs. None of the 3 are currently ministers. Although Olavo broke with Bolsonaro in 2020, the Brazilian president mourned his death on social media. He wrote that Olavo was one of the greatest intellectuals of the country's history and called him a giant in the fight for liberty. A fan of conspiracy theories, Olavo de Carvalho saw signs of communist domination on all sides and was a propagator of misinformation. He used to say, for instance, that Pepsi had aborted fetuses in its soda. President Jair Bolsonaro sanctioned, with vetoes, the 2022 budget. Before Bolsonaro, the country's National Congress approved the budget last December. The Ministry of Labor was the most affected, with a $1 billion cut, equivalent to $180 million. The second most affected was the Ministry of Education, with a cut of R$800 million. The presidential veto forbids spending R$22 million to buy school vehicles. The promotion of undergraduate and graduate courses, teaching, research, and extension projects lost R$4.2 million. The health area, vital for combating the pandemic, also had spending cuts, losing more than R$74 million. Fiocruz, a health research agency that produces vaccines against COVID-19, had its budget reduced by R$11 million. According to the executive power, spending cuts are necessary in order to pay the federal servants. Despite the cuts in essential areas, the president kept R$1.7 billion to grant salary readjustments to public servants in 2022. The president intends to contemplate the police, an important part of his electorate.
In 2017, then President Michel Temer implemented in Brazil a labor reform, inspired by the reform that occurred in Spain a few years earlier in 2012. But the current Spanish government is reverting that legislation. Former President Lula, pre-candidate to the presidency this electoral year, has been talking with Spain's executive and legislative powers to know more about their experience.
On January 11th, former President Lula, together with leaders of the Workers' Party and trade unions, met with representatives of the Spanish government and legislature to gather experiences on the reversion of the labor reform. Sociologist Clemente Gans Lúcio from Perseu Abramo Foundation were at the meeting. He shares comments on the changes led by the Spanish Socialist Party.
The changes are mainly thought to improve the employment contracts and combat the existing short-term employment contracts.
Brazil's labor reform changed 300 legislative topics, allowing the outsourcing of all activities. It weakens the workers' bargaining power and undermines the union's actions. According to data from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, the number of formal jobs in Brazil fell by half in 2020 compared to the previous year. Meanwhile, the total of Brazilians informally working skyrocketed, reaching 36 million workers last October, according to the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. The business environment has changed a lot since the beginning of the 21st century, and that's a central issue to a possible Brazilian labor counter-reform. Also, the employment relationship was absorbed by the new technologies, especially in the service sector.
It's necessary to create a new protection model to face a different reality of labor. One where communication technology opened the door to a universe of possibilities that were unseen until recently. We must present ways to protect workers that are not necessarily in a classical wage-earning work relationship. Nevertheless, their rights must be guaranteed as those of any other worker.
A bill that introduced protection measures to app delivery workers during the pandemic became law after almost 2 years underway. Federal Deputy Ivan Valente, the bill's author, complains about the delay in adopting the measures, but celebrates having contributed to initiating a broader discussion on the precariness of work.
Momento em que, se governo progressista
When a democratic, progressive, and popular government comes to power here in Brazil, it must review this legislation that was perverse and cruel to workers. It is cruel to the workers on a daily basis.
Naná Vasconcelos, who died in 2016, was considered the world's best percussionist. However, this collection has uncertain destiny.
Juvenal de Vasconcelos, internationally known as Naná Vasconcelos, was 8 times honored with Grammy Awards and Downbeat magazine as the world's best percussionist. But it was in the official opening of Recife's Carnival that Naná Vasconcelos was crowned in front of dozens of maracatus. It was his celebration in the city where he was born in 1944, where he lived his whole life until he died in 2016. However, it is still uncertain whether Vasconcelos' collection will remain there or not. Last week, almost 6 years after his death, the house where Vasconcelos lived started to be disassembled. His collection was moved to another location. The musician, widow, and producer, Patricia Vasconcelos, is responsible for his collection. She complains about the lack of interest in preserving the percussionist's legacy.
Com muita tristeza, eu tenho que dizer.
I feel very sad for saying that I never was contacted by private, public, governmental or non-governmental institutions to talk about the maintenance of Naná's works and collection. So I had to remove important things from his collection because I'm gonna rent the house. I'm tired of waiting for so long.
Besides Vasconcelos' material legacy with books, albums, and musical instruments, there is also the legacy he left through his musicality and groups. An example of this is the group Voz Nagô, created by Naná Vasconcelos and formed by 7 black women who are practitioners of candomblé.
O acervo dele tem que ficar no Brasil.
His collection must stay in Brazil. It must be in Recife, Pernambuco state. He was born here. He was whole here. He could travel all over the world, but he always lived here. He never lived in a different city.
Eu não queria que isso ficasse só.
I didn't want Naná's work to be scattered around the world, while in Brazil people say that he was the best percussionist ever, but not preserving his collection.
And now it's time for Brazilianese.
Hoje eu vou ensinar esse.
Today I'll teach you how to make a wild card tomato sauce. You can eat it with bread, you can eat it with pasta. What makes it different? It's prepared in the oven, super practical. I'll start by chopping the carrot. You have to cut it really thinly because it's harder, it takes longer to cook. If it stays al dente, the sauce won't have this velvety consistency. Now I'm gonna chop the tomato. Cut it in half, remove this tip, cut the tomato in 2 or 3 pieces. The cherry tomatoes I'll cut in half. Now to the parsley. Now I'll chop the onion in a wedge shape. Now I'm going to season it. I add a little sugar to help it caramelize, a little bit of salt, then I mix it all together. I place it on the baking tray and spread it out well. I sprinkle it with olive oil. Now I'll place my unpeeled garlic in a corner of the tray. I'll leave it in the oven for about 30 minutes at a really high temperature. Now I'll take the garlic cloves and squeeze them one by one. This garlic pulp becomes very sweet. It's a whole other flavor. And now just shred it.
You like the show? So hit the like button and share with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive notifications. We will see you next week.